welcome to Don't Know Much About, where curiosity always kicks off the conversation. And today, we're all in for a huge treat as I sit down with Daniel Levine, the rabbi of UC Irvine, Hillel. Daniel's also a lecturer at UC Irvine in Jewish studies and the host of his very own YouTube show and podcast, the Rabbi Daniel Levine podcast. Daniel and I both attended UCLA, though I gather at different times where we both took classes in Jewish history. Now, I had the pleasure of being a guest on his show just a few weeks ago discussing the origins of Holocaust universalization in the Soviet Union and how the very anti-Zionism crafted by a regime that no longer exists is haunting our streets and schools here in the United States. I want to welcome Rabbi Daniel Levine to my show. And to kick it right off with a question I always ask my guests, which is, what is one thing that is on your mind right now, top of mind, or something that best captures your philosophy that can be summed up in a tagline?
I love it. I'm very bad at taglines. First of all, thank you so much. The thing that I've thought about recently, and I think it really goes to my core educational mission, is we can't in the Jewish community bifurcate Israel, Zionism, and anti-Semitism as sort of separate spheres, as separate from cultivating strong Jewish identity, Jewish history, knowledge of Jewish texts. And I think we've made an educational mistake in the Jewish community by saying, well, there's, Talmud and there's Torah and then there's anti-Semitism and Holocaust and Zionism, because that allows then young students to sort of say, okay, well, I'll have these two and these three, but maybe Zionism's not a part of my Jewish identity, as opposed to us educating a much more, fluid direction of, no, these are all core parts of Jewish identity, and we're not going to differentiate between, these disparate parts of Jewishness.
I love that. I love that because, well, I have so many questions for you on that. My first question is, when did you have this sort of awakening that we shouldn't bifurcate these parts of our Jewish selves? Or is that always something that you believed?
Yeah, listen, I grew up in the Orthodox community, and I've, obviously my entire professional life has been in the sort of world of pluralistic or liberal Judaism. In the modern Orthodox community that I grew up in, there wasn't really this inorganic bifurcation, because for us, Israel, Judaism, memory of anti-Semitism / the Holocaust, those were all sort of like taken for granted and wrapped in. In other words, in high school, we didn't have to be given a class on the history of Zionism or the history of Israel to understand that Israel is a core part of our Jewishness. It was every single week, slapping us in the face when we opened the Torah or reading the Talmud or delving into medieval Jewish thought debates. I mean, Israel's ubiquitous. I mean, I probably don't have to tell you, but all you need is to open up any Jewish book to understand that, yes, Israel and anti-Semitism and all these things have played a role in our history the entire time. And so that allows you to not have to separate it in the sense of, okay, we'll have 1 hour a week where we'll talk about anti-Semitism and another hour a week talking about Zionism. What I discovered in the sort of world of liberal Judaism is there's been such a heightened focus, and this is what a little bit of what we spoke about when you graciously came on my podcast, about there's been such a focus on the Holocaust and Israel as sort of core parts of liberal Jewish education. And I think that's a mistake because Jewish history is a lot more vast than the years between 1933 and 1948. And I think we just do a disservice to students if we give them only one tiny snapshot of Jewish history, because then that allows them to ask questions like, well, is it really true that Jews were one day, a long time ago living in the land of Israel, or is that just a religious myth, right? I've gotten that question actually from another Hillel staff member a couple years ago. And it wasn't antagonistic. She was generally wondering because she just, I guess had never been taught, the archaeologic record and the history, and opened up any Jewish thinker between Josephus and King David, for 1,000 years. And so I think it was that migration coming in from the Orthodox community and then a little bit being shocked at the education that's happening outside of the Orthodox Jewish community.
Right. Well, look, I want to comment on a lot of what you said. First, I want to tell you that Okay, I want to tell you that when I was a college student at UC Santa Cruz in the early 2000s is when this anti-Zionism emerged. And when I went to the Jewish professionals on campus, and by the way, that was the Hillel on my campus, one of the things, if not the, or, point that was being drilled to me by Jewish professionals was that Zionism is political. Zionism is not part of identity. Zionism should be relegated to political discourse, and that I'm mistaken when I think that what's happening is anti-Jewish situation on my campus. And so I was 18, 19, and my gut was telling me that they're wrong, but I didn't have the historical literacy of what you're talking about to know. I just had my gut that was telling me, no, this is anti-Semitism. But I want to talk about a few things. I think that you're right. And as much as this hurts me, I think it is true that we have to study this phenomenon of why within the secular liberal Jewish community, Israel has become this surrogate for Jewish identity. Why is that? And I want to ask you that. I have certainly my idea, but I'm curious before I offer my perspective, why do you think that it's true that we've kind of within the secular Jewish, pluralistic Jewish day schools and youth movements, if I had to kind of identify what are the main um, events or main moments that come to symbolize Jewish identity, it's the Holocaust and then Israel. And you're saying that's probably not that's an incomplete picture of what it means to be a Jew. And I agree with you, but my question is, why do you think that has come to fill that lacuna?
Yeah, yeah. So two really important, I think, historic inflection points here. One, I think one of the most prescient Jews, really, since maybe biblical periods, Asher Ginsburg slash Shachad Am. Just for listeners' background, First Zionist Congress, Herzl very much pushes his political Zionist agenda. There was sort of a young man there. He came from a Hasidic family in more Eastern Europe, but he, like many Jews at the time, thrusted off the sort of old Orthodoxy. But he stayed very connected to Jewish culture, Jewish ideas, Jewish history. And, now he's known as sort of the founder of cultural Zionism. But he writes this very powerful essay where he essentially accuses Herzl of only tackling half the problem. He says, Herzl's only worried about Jews. I'm worried about Judaism as well. And he has this one line. The reason why he was so prescient is because he understood that Judaism, right? I'm not talking about Jews and Jewish safety, but Judaism, the religion, the culture, the history in the diaspora is ill-equipped to being able to evolve on its own accord. And he writes, it's one of the most important essays, I think, in modern Jewish thought, this essay by Achad Am. And he says, what we need is a cultural center that'll go breathe life into the diaspora because Jews are at risk of, as many different versions of Judaism as there are countries in the world. And I think he has this other line where he essentially says, Judaism is becoming an ever more diluted confessional religion that most adherents don't actually believe in the diaspora, right? And so, he's sort of holding up a mirror to the Jewish diaspora. I would say this is certainly the case in America today, where the reality is, and, this is not a moral statement, this is a descriptive statement. The majority of American Jews outside the Orthodox community, and I also consider myself no longer in the Orthodox community, happy to get into that, but they don't have a strong connection with God, right? Maybe they believe in God or maybe they're agnostic and, they don't have a deep knowledge of Jewish texts. So they don't have the sort of pedagogical background to really be a fan of the Talmud or Maimonides or medieval Jewish poetry or Hasidic literature. They're not super connected to Jewish communal ritual. And so it's not like they're orthoprax and going through the motions. And so if you start to strip all of those away, you ask, okay, well, what's left? One half is the ever more diluted confessional religion, right? So you have, Reform and conservative temples or synagogues that people go to on the high holidays and maybe for their bar bat mitzvah and then maybe again right before they get married. But it's not really a source of meaning. And certainly in the last, 30, 40 years, it's become less and less meaningful. The second important historic inflection point is post-1967, which really had this correlation between, for a long time in America, the Jewish mantra was to try to, yes, remain Jewish, but a Jew at home and be an assimilationist in the streets and kind of, keep our head down. We have a good thing going here. Let's not try to ruffle too many feathers by pushing, Jewish particularity narratives and by being, proud public Jews. And after the Six-Day War, in the 60s, it was a time of particularism, right? So you have, people in that black community, the Black Panther movement and, proud and black. And you have, I think, either second or third wave feminism, right? People being, loud in the streets with their identity. And after the sort of euphoria of the Six-Day War, where the Jewish world went from thinking another Holocaust was imminent to one of the most euphoric times possibly in Jewish history, many Jews simply took that to the streets, and that was all about Israel and Zionism. And it sort of, and again, it's sexier, right, to use a non-rabbinic word, right? Like I can sit there, and I've even found myself in the past falling into this trap. I can excitedly talk about the exodus from Egypt or the return from Babylonian captivity in the 6th century or BCE, and that for students is like, okay, sure. But 67, I mean, we have pictures, we have books, we can, listen to the radio and what it was like when, Har HaBayit B'Yadenu, the Temple Mounts in our hands. And so between both, Achad Ha'am being correct in terms of Israel being the focal point of Jewish diaspora, mixed with the fact that, like, this is something we can really be proud of in terms of the state of Israel. And I agree with both of those things. I agree with Achad Ha'am, and I agree that post 67, we should have moved towards more of, cheering of Israel. But I think some people took that too far to the extent that Israel and Zionism sort of became their entirety of their Jewish identity. And that's, I think, a mistake.
Very interesting. So and I'm glad you gave a kind of much more of a answer rooted in Jewish texts, Ahad Ha'am, and that's fascinating, really, where he, as you said, was very prescient, predicting where we're at today, where Zionism is kind of filling in that lacuna for us, and kind of we're having a piecemeal um, Jewish identity. And I'm curious what you think of this. I have a sort of a different answer as to why Zionism has filled that void for American Jewry. And my answer goes more historical in the sense that when the Jews arrived, Eastern European Jews, or excuse me, I should not Eastern Jews of Germany came to the United States of America in the 1800s. They issued something known as the Pittsburgh Platform Manifesto. I think it was in the 1860s or 1870s. So don't quote me on the date. But if you study the Pittsburgh Platform Manifesto, it's these principles that they outline the Jewish community as to who are we and what do what are we going to retain in America and what are we going to jettison, right? And when I learned about it many years ago, I was kind of shocked, but at the same time not, that one of the things that they decided that they are not going to preserve is the idea of Judaism as a national identity. That Judaism is a religious identity, and that the idea that they use the word Palestine because, as you know, historically, Palestine always meant Jewish land, right? They, in that document, that Palestine is not our home. Our home is the United States of America. Now, by discarding Palestine as the ethnic home of the Jewish people, what they also did is erased the ethnicity that is central to Jewish identity. And it makes sense. Now, we could judge them, but it kind of makes sense because America, what is America? America is a place where people can go and practice their religion freely. America is not a country that's rooted in ethnocentrism, as let's say Eastern Europe and Russia. And so it made sense that they are trying to build a Jewish identity that would fit this American landscape. But inevitably, what happened by framing Jewish identity as being just religious and not ethnic and not national, Zionism receded in America for American Jewry. Because what is Zionism? At least to me, it's Jewish nationalism. And so there is this revival of Jewish nationalism happening within American Jewry because it's kind of having a moment of return. Because for many years, American Jewry only understood themselves as a religious minority. That's why, and you could please correct me if I'm wrong. That's why I think, and that's why I started with my story in the early 2000s. That's why I think that the American Jewish community was not truly equipped to understand anti-Zionism, because anti-Zionism is an attack on national origin of the Jewish people at its core, right? And so because that idea that Jews are a nation, an ethnicity has been eroded and has receded to such great distance, American Jewry, Reform Jewry, I'm mostly talking about conservative, and I want to get to the Orthodox movement in a bit, wasn't prepared to understand that anti-Zionism is an attack of Jewish national origin. So what are your thoughts on that kind of reading of the of why Zionism is having this comeback? Because there's a nationalism that's coming back within the Jewish movement.
Mm. Amazing. So many great, fodder points. One, you were close. 1885 is Pittsburgh Platform. There's an article, a really interesting article by a scholar named Jonathan Gribbetz, who wrote an article called "The PLO's Rabbi." The PLO, obviously, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was seen as a terrorist group from Israel from the 60s until really, Yitzhak Rabin's time. And he wrote his article traces how the understanding of Jewish identity that was on display in the Palestinian world and arguably still is borrowed from exactly what you're describing. And so the reason why the Arab world and the Palestinian world, and I'll include, the current day American left, just can't understand Zionism is because of the fault, essentially, of the Reform rabbis in 1880. So you're for sure right. I differentiate, and if please push back if you disagree, anti-Zionism coming within the Jewish world before the state of Israel was created, right? So two important caveats. I think is very legitimate. I think there was a time in both Western European and American Jewish history and thought between 1840s, and no one was really thinking about Zionism, but you have people like Moshe Hess, who's writing I think in the 60s, and Leon Pinsker in the 70s, and then later on obviously with Herzl and what we consider classical Zionists later on in the 80s and 90s. But there really was an honest conversation to be had in the Jewish community of thinking that emancipation and assimilation into Europe, would work out. I mean, Herzl himself was also an assimilationist. Herzl's goal was for Jews to assimilate. At some point, he realized Jews wouldn't be able to assimilate as individuals, so he thought, okay, great, we'll just assimilate into the Council of Nations, or the Nation of Nations, I think he calls it. There were a lot of good reasons to push back against Zionism if you were a Jew in America or Germany in 1900. For one, the anti-Zionist Jews, and again, I very much differentiate an anti-Zionist Jew writing in Berlin in 1900 and, than an anti-Zionist person today in Brooklyn, right? So those are like two completely different things, which is why I think the distinction of, anti-Zionist without the hyphen and with the hyphen is actually very helpful, because one, I think, is a legitimate set of ideas. The other is just anti-Semitism. But just talking about the legitimate set of ideas, the Jewish world was making the argument for about 100+ years in Western Europe that Jews should be treated as equal because, if we usher in this newfound liberalism and everyone's treated as individuals, it doesn't actually matter what Jews do. It shouldn't matter if I'm religious or not religious or what my skin tone is or whatever. Like liberalism, individualism, great. We want this. The anti-Semites in places like Germany and France and Italy and America were saying, no, 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 Jews are different. Jews are not really French. Jews are a state within a state. They're not loyal to France. They're not going to back us if we're in a war. And so most Jews at the time, including, the Reform movement was obviously the biggest movement in Germany and then the biggest movement in America really until about 1900. They were saying, no, 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 we are fully committed to this current nation state. If it's France, we're French. If it's Germany, we're German. If it's America, we're American. So we don't want to return to some homeland. So they were, we have to sort of understand that argument situated in the history. By the time World War I happened, because this is sort of another, we can probably give, 30 inflection points of American Jews and Zionism. After World War I, two important things happened in the Jewish world. One, a huge proliferation of anti-Semitism in Europe, right? Probably don't have to get into that. The second that people might know a little bit less is between 1881 and 1914, about 2.5 million Jews came to America, right? This is, many of my great-grandparents, right? The classic through Ellis Island from Eastern Europe, fleeing pogroms. Very few, there was the Aliyah from Eastern Europe, but like very, very few Jews were interested in going to, the Ottoman Empire. Again, this is even before a British mandate. And America basically had open borders. And so, any Jew, if they can muster up enough money to like sit on a boat for a couple weeks, were able to get here. In 1924, huge uptick in anti-Semitism in America also, right? People like Charles Coughlin and Henry Ford and that story.
Yeah.
And America shuts its borders in 1924, right at the time when obviously Jews are going to start needing immigration the most. And so many American Jews just sort of like tacitly accepted Zionism. I think the Reform movement, they put out the Columbus platform. I don't remember the exact date, but that was right in response to 1924 being like, oh, shoot, Europe's about to be on fire.
Mhm.
America's closed its borders. So, of course, we need to support, strong Jewish political entity there as well. The anti-Zionism that I think we're dealing with now, right? Like almost no one that I've met, maybe there's like one or two people, but like who are putting forth anti-Zionist arguments, I think are the type of like good faith anti-Zionism that people like, Franz Rosenzweig or Hermann
Right.
Cohen or yeah.
Well, I wouldn't push back at all. The only difference that I make is I call these early pre-state Jews who had an issue with Zionism as non-Zionists. That's how I kind of discuss them when I teach. I talk about, and by the way, the hyphen here really is very helpful, because it differentiates between people who were against, let's say, Zionism versus full-on Jew haters. We're
Sure.
talking,
But
right?
but some of these early, I guess, non-Zionists, I mean, they were really non-Zionist. In other words, there was there was a British Jewish journalist named Lucian Wolff who writes in 1904 a book called The Zionist Peril. And he essentially says something which is simultaneously probably true and also kind of like tough to put ourselves in the mindset where he essentially accuses the Zionists of siding with the anti-Semites. He's like, the liberals, both the Jewish liberals, and I don't mean liberal in the same sense of like, Democrats today, but like people who wanted basic liberalism, right? So both mainstream conservatives and mainstream liberals in America today are both capital L liberals. I mean, hopefully it stays that way. But he was saying, the liberals, both Jewish and non-Jewish, are trying to usher in individualism and liberalism, and it doesn't actually matter what your national or ethnic or religious identity is. Then you have the anti-Semites who are saying, no, 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 Jews are different. And then you have the Zionists saying, no, 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 Jews are different. We need our own thing. And so, like, from his perspective, he thought that Zionism was not just like, oh, if you're an Orthodox Jew and I'm not, like, live and let live, whatever. He really did think it was dangerous. But I think the important point is, by the end of the World Wars, that was no longer like an opinion that really anyone in the Jewish world had, by the 30s or 40s.
Yeah, and here I'm going to reference Ruth Weiss. Ruth Weiss, who I love, she's a thought leader for me and a mentor. Um, she spoke about this idea of, well, there's one thing about a couple who's about to have a child, who doesn't have the child yet, who's discussing the pros and cons of having a child, and one of the partners vociferously says, no, we should not have the child, versus the child has been born and the couple is sitting and discussing whether the child should remain alive. And I guess that's kind of the difference that I have with these Jewish non-Zionists or anti-Zionists, where the state hasn't yet reestablished, has not yet been reborn. And so I treat them very differently. And I'm sure you do too, as somebody like a Peter Beinart, who is a full-on anti-Zionist. And that kind of discourse, once the child has already been born, is a completely different story. It has different ramifications for the safety and well-being of Jewish people.
Yes, 100%. Meaning, in other words, I 100% agree with you. Both Jewish Zionists and non-Zionists slash anti-Zionists in 1910 wanted what was best for the Jewish community and the Jewish world. Like that much is clear. They had very different visions of, do we do A or B? Now Jewish anti-Zionists they've almost given up on like Jewish people or Jewish particularism and
Correct.
yeah,
Correct.
100%.
Yes. Well, I want to actually talk to you about the Orthodox movement and the Zionism. When we began this conversation, you said you grew up in the modern Orthodox world, and for you, there wasn't this emphasis on Israel and Zionism because it was just it permeated the texts. It was Israel was in the Torah and the Talmud. It was just it was part of the lived experience of being a Jew. S- Something that I've come across, encountered with working with the modern Orthodox Jewish student population is a very strange phenomenon, which is, yes, Israel is central to Judaism. Yes, Israel and Zion is mentioned, but we lived without Israel for 2,000 years. And in fact, we can continue to have the sustainability of an Israel. Do we need political sovereignty there? Is what they ask me. Meaning, just because Israel doesn't exist, let's say, God forbid, as a politically sovereign country, doesn't mean Israel doesn't exist for the Jews. What would you say? And by the way, is that something that you ever encountered within your community?
The modern the modern Orthodox community is kind of divided between two impulses, both Zionistic, but very differently. One is the sort of religious Zionistic impulse of, people like Abraham Isaac Kook, right, the first chief rabbi of Israel, through, modern day institutions in Israel that we would consider Dati Leumi, but really they're like, on the modern Zion, modern Orthodox spectrum. And, I grew up going to Bnei Akiva camp, which is, Orthodox religious Zionist. I grew up in a high school that was Bnei Akiva. So, I'm selling this sort of, political Zionism a little short. I mean, we would, every year during Yom HaTzmaut, we would say Hallel with a bracha, right? This is, just for listeners that aren't familiar, Hallel is a prayer service that's meant for just Jewish holidays. And so the modern Orthodox community I grew up in essentially made or decided, I mean, someone had to decide sometime in the 40s or 50s, that Israeli independence, political sovereignty, is a Jewish holiday on par with Hanukkah and Purim and Passover, worthy of singing, these set of songs and this blessing. The other, which, again, the modern, this is not a binary, but Joseph Soloveitchik, right, the sort of founder of American modern Orthodoxy, he was the head of YU. He was a Zionist, but he was a lot less of what we would call a religious Zionist. I believe he said he was sort of agnostic as to whether or not political sovereignty of Israel is necessarily intertwined with like a deep Jewish religiousness or whether it's not. His students are kind of divided between that. So you'd kind of get all the sense. I mean, he was very much, Jewish life needs to revolve around Jewish law and halacha, and that is more important in some sense than the Zionism. And so what was interesting about the religious Zionist community and Rav Kook is he very much believed that secular Jews who were Zionists were fulfilling some divine mission, and that in some way, by them working the land, even if it was on Yom Kippur, they were still doing something generally good for the world. And he was also willing to, I don't want to get too in the weeds and then people will shut this off, but like, he found a lot of very interesting Jewish loopholes to make Zionism work. One interesting example is there's a biblical law called Shemitah, or sabbatical year, where every 7 years you don't
Yeah.
work the land. This is an idea that is ubiquitous throughout the Tanakh. The Talmud and Midrash, that we're talking rabbinic literature, 1st through 10th century CE, speaks about the sabbatical year as like one of the most important things. It's like, if you don't keep the sabbatical year, famine comes to the world. If you don't keep the sabbatical year, God kicks the Jews out of Israel, right? Like, the rabbis clearly took this idea very seriously. But how do you run a modern economy in 1920s in British Mandate Palestine, where every 7 years taking off? So, like, classic Jewish loophole. He sold, sell the land to an Arab farmer, and it's their land, so technically you can work it, right? We've all heard of similar loopholes. So those type of ideas, the other half of American modern Orthodoxy, the Joseph Soloveitchik types, kind of frowned upon. And in their mind, you can't make the state a religious value that's more than,
Mhm.
religious Judaism. But the vast majority of the American modern Orthodox community like is very Zionistic. Even if when we go into the theology, maybe some of them are divided. Is this connected to Judaism and Messianism? Is this just really important because it's a place that protects the Jews? One other interesting thing to throw out there, then I'll pass it back to you, is Chabad, which is not modern Orthodox. It's Hasidic, but probably the most visible Orthodox Jews for people that are in the liberal Jewish community. They are also not Zionists, right? They're never going to sing Hatikva. They're not going to have Israeli flags anywhere in their house. They're not going to celebrate Yom HaTzmaut. And yet they're very pro-Israel, right? Yeah, and it's exactly this differentiation.
Yeah, but and I understand the Chabad issue with secular Zionism, um, but the issue is that if you ask a Chabad rabbi, is the goal to rule over Israel? It is. It's just how do we get there? It's a disagreement of how it's a theological disagreement of how we get there, waiting, this is also getting into the Neturei Karta movement. Like, I actually think, and this is going to sound very crazy, I think that they are actually Zionists, even though they hate Zionism. If you ask them, is the land promised to the Jewish people by Hashem, by God? It is. Is the goal for the Jewish people to rule over this land? It is. There's just a disagreement of how we get there. And so when those students tell me, well, we don't really need to have sovereignty. Well, what is sovereignty? It's ruling the land. I think that's incorrect.
Yeah, I mean, according to modern Orthodox philosophy, those students are incorrect, right? Like modern Orthodoxy equally believes in, Mashiach and a third temple being built in Israel, and obviously, the reinstatement of a Jewish king over the land and the entirety
Yeah.
of the land, right? The river to the sea, as we call it. And so, yeah, that is official Orthodox belief. Neturei Karta and Satmar are interesting. I also make this point where they're I guess what I'll say is they obviously are not severing the connection between Jews and the land of Israel, right? So I think
Not
there,
exactly. That's really important. Yes, go ahead.
no, no. So I was going to say, like, there is this progressive and liberal, maybe some Jews adopt this, but mostly in the non-Jewish mainstream, that if Judaism's a religion, which again is an incorrect premise, but with their understanding that Judaism's a religion, because interestingly enough, both the most liberal, old school Reform Jews call Judaism a religion, and if you go Orthodox enough, they start referring to Judaism as a religion
The
again. So it's a very
religion.
interesting
Yes.
phenomenon. So if you accept their premise, which again I don't, but like if you do, then they say, well, why does a religion need a land? A religion's a set of ideas and morals and beliefs about God. What does it have to do to a real estate? And a lot of them will hold up groups like Satmar or Neturei Karta as like, look, these are Jews that are again, and it's so wrong. I mean, okay, we can talk about, tokenization and progressive double standards and like that's there, but it's even more incorrect on just a deep level of like, you guys don't understand. Neturei Karta and Satmar, in their mind, any minute now,
Yeah.
eagles come and lift us out of our houses in LA and Irvine and plop us in, and there, a giant temple comes and destroys Al Aqsa Mosque and Dome of the Rock, and all of the Arabs there, somehow either leave or get converted to Judaism or maybe stay in, second class citizenship, right? Like, it's very much not the progressive world that like the blue haired Marxists want when they're holding up Neturei Karta as like, look, these are our allies.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm really glad we made this point. You made this point because I think it's so important for people who are listening and for my students who often tell me that, look, you don't have to be a Zionist to be a Jew. In fact, the most religious Zionists are not the most religious Zionists, but absolutely right. In their, ideal world, in their world that they pray to every day, we're going to be taken by eagles, everyone, to go and live in the land of Israel. So speaking of students, and you work with students on college campus, and you have a sort of pulse on their day-to-day challenges. I want to shift this conversation to what are your observations in terms of the Hasbara? Why has Hasbara failed us? I mean, I have so many of my own thoughts, but I'm obviously here to hear your thoughts. What are our kids doing? Are they doing something new or different? What's it like? Do you have a sense being you are on college campus with them?
Yeah, I think Hasbara has failed for a lot of the reasons we were talking about before. Let's use the kid analogy. If you're already starting off from the premise of handing out to students, here are 10 reasons why my child is legitimate, that puts the question on the table. And yes, there are people who want to discredit Israel and Israel's legitimacy, but that's not a game that I think we should be playing. I don't think it's helpful for students who know very little about their own Jewish identity and Jewish history and Israel and Zionism, all of these things that are interconnected, to say, if someone tells you Israel has no right to exist, you tell them, no, 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 the UN did this vote and then this war happened. Like, that's too much in the nitty gritty as opposed to just almost just laughing them off. Like, if someone comes up to me and says, what connection do Jews have with Israel? My question's probably, do you actually want to have a real conversation about this, or are you just saying that? But it's almost like they're not. I mean, this sounds bad, and as an educator, I would never say it to their face, but like I act as if we're not on the same level here. We're not, it's like if I went into the physics department. I know nothing about physics. I took one math class in college and no physics classes. And I walk in and I say, I think your nuclear reactor would be a little bit better if you, like, they would rightfully so look at me and just laugh me out of the room. And I think we just kind of have to have that approach to the people that are like really challenging all of the obvious facts of Jewish history. And so I think that a lot of these initiatives that many Jewish organizations, I mean, we can name them. I mean, I think Hillel's done this also. I'm very proud to work for Hillel, but I know that Hillel oftentimes has sort of fallen into the trap of if we just have one more seminar about common misconceptions about Israel and Judaism, we can just convince people. And I don't think any of it works. I do think, contrary to what you would get if you just read, popular media, is most Jews have, I think, increased their support for Israel in connection with the Jewish community. And so this idea that like young Jews are becoming anti-Zionists in droves, again, there probably have been a small percentage of Jews who have moved, proverbially to the left on Israel and Zionism. I've seen it much more in the other direction. Both undergrads, grad students, and also professors. That's actually the most interesting thing. People don't usually talk about professors.
Mhm.
I've been, at UCI for 5 years before October 7th. I knew like two or three professors that had any interest in interacting with me or the Jewish community or whatever. Now there's a group of about 50 Jewish faculty at UC Irvine, and I know other schools have done the same, that meet regularly, not always to talk about, Zionism and anti-Semitism, but just to have community. And, we're thinking for this year doing like a monthly course of study, around some texts and things like that. And so for a lot of Jews, I think it's sort of like hardened ourselves and, made us more communal, and everything there. And then I think a lot of Jews have been, for every Jew who's become a radical JVP anti-Israelist, two Jews, much more quietly, are stopping from being a progressive and becoming either a centrist or a conservative. And so, it's disingenuous, and it was sort of painful, in the lead up to the election. I would see the New York Times run an article, these young Jews are part of the, don't even vote for Harris campaign because she was quote unquote supporting genocide. And the New York Times would highlight, students at some, vague Ivy League as if they represent the Jewish community. And the conversations I was having with Jewish students, and again, I'm being descriptive, not normative here, is students that have told me, I think I'm going to vote for Trump, even though I hate Trump. And, and it's not just, I always say this, it's not just the Israeli or Persian or Orthodox students who anyway have a conservative leaning. I was talking to one student, I obviously won't give their name, non-binary, short hair, 19, very crunchy granola. You look at this person and like you would bet your life savings that they are not voting Republican. And I remember talking to them the night or the morning after the election. And I, wanted to check in with students. And, I was like, hey, how are you feeling about this? And I expected like, okay, like let's get coffee, we can process feelings. I'm so excited. I was so happy. I think Trump is going to do all the right thing. And I was like so taken aback. I was like, wait, like I don't usually like kind of break the third wall. I was like, wait a minute, you vote? Like I was like, I just want to understand this better. Not that I disagree with you. I'm so curious. And so that's, I think, an equally valid story that we need to tell.
Absolutely. I have a dear friend. She's a professor of political science in her field of interest is gender studies and obviously in the political science field. And you would probably think she's, on the left. And she and I were talking the other day, and she's like, I'm ecstatically happy that Trump won. And I'm like, this just does not compute in my mind because, she traditionally, classically wouldn't have voted this way. And she's explaining to me that there are a lot of people who are quietly this, as you're describing, this strange phenomenon. Maybe it's not that strange. But let's go back to Hasbara not
But there
working.
was also, sorry, can I just say one more comment
Yeah.
on that? So a study came out a week ago. I'm forgetting who did the study. People can easily Google it. It revealed 88%. So this is almost, everyone on college campuses self-censor their own views for fears that they
Yeah.
want to look more progressive than they are. And I think this is the fault of higher education and the fact that on average on campus, it's the sociology grad students that are the craziest progressives, and they're in charge of grading and, helping you get internships. And so I see this like crazy students when once they get to know me and there's a group of, two or three of us talking and they know it's sort of private, the stuff they're saying about politics and the world and, everything like, gender, and society and, religion and Trump and all these things completely different than those same people when it's sort of a more public setting where they're like, kind of affirming all the progressive niceties.
Right. Yeah, I think I know the study you're referring to. Was I think either conducted by Heritage or Axiom, but anyway, yeah. So you're absolutely right. There's this contingent of this silent, probably growing majority of people who are kind of betraying these progressive values, if you will, and voting, especially if they're Jews, they're voting for what's best for Jews. But I do want to go back to Hasbara and its failure. And I kind of want to, confess to you and to everyone that for many, many years, I was part of a movement that was building curriculum, and I still am, to try to teach kids as much as possible on the Arab-Israeli conflict. And many times I meet a lot of community members who are like, okay, my child has a teacher who said this in the classroom. Please point her to an article or a book. But what they're asking me really is, how do I obtain a quick PhD in Middle Eastern studies and know everything there is to know about Israel? Like you said, Israel doesn't have a right to exist. Oh, let's go back to the San Remo, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the British Mandate period, the White Papers, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, let's retrace this entire history and get into the minutia. And I thought for many, many years that by passing this knowledge to the Jewish kids, I was arming them to be able to stand up for themselves. But I have to admit, and I'm very concerned that I may have contributed to their participation on their trial, on the trial of the Jewish people. Like, there is no conversation. As you say, you laugh it off. It's as ridiculous as if I came to the physics department and questioned quantum physics or quantum mechanics and its legitimacy in the field. It's and 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 so I was talking to one of my students about this, and I said, I think you need, I think that when you are being told Israel doesn't have a right to exist or Israel is a colonizer, you call out the libel, you call it out, and you move on. And he said to me, that's great. But before I call out the libel, I want to know the history myself. So the history does give me the confidence, he says. But I really think that this whole Hasbara, like when they say this, you say this, and when they say this, you say that. 10 points, the case for Israel, even that wording, the case for Israel, you are continuing that trial of going back to that analogy, the extended metaphor now of the child being born. There's no conversation anymore. It's born. So what do you tell what are your students doing? Like, how are they navigating this? What are they doing now that's different from this classical Hasbara? Are they doing anything differently?
I mean, I think it's pretty ingrained. I also think that there's kind of two different things. And I always say, I mean, even when we're talking about criticism of Israel, because I think in the Jewish community and in Israeli society, I mean, Israel can't be made into an idol either. So I think, you know, we have to be able to talk critically about Israel and Israeli policy and, Israeli actions historically. So there is a bucket of this is crazy, this is libel, we're not going to entertain this. And then there's a bucket of like, okay, did Israel do the right thing in the 1970s by allowing the settlement movement to, build a bunch of settlements? Like that, maybe I have strong opinions. I do have strong opinions, but like, I think that's a reasonable conversation to be had in the Jewish community and in Israeli society. Same with now. I mean, I'm sure everyone listening to this has strong opinions one way or another of whether or not they think the 300,000 people who just protested in Israel are correct or the government is correct in continuing the war. But we have to be able to, I think educationally, Jewish students, both on the high school and college level, need to be able to understand both sides and that this isn't simple because these are constrained within the bounds of reasonableness, right? Like clearly in Israeli society right now, within the Overton window of the mainstream, there are some people who think the war should end, even if that means Hamas stays in power and we'll deal with them later. And another group that says, no, 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 this is just going to happen again in 3 years. If we pull out, then we'll have a war in, 2028. And so that to me is very different than somebody questioning Israel's right to exist and legitimacy. So I think there is a lot of value for Jewish students to understand the history and, what happened in 1948. What are the questions we still have? What was the legacy of the Six-Day War? What questions do we have? The Second Intifada, the disengagement from Gaza, like all of these questions down to like, the huge movement that was taking up all the oxygen before October 7th, the judicial reform. I mean, I did plenty of conversations with students on the judicial reform. I had quite strong opinions on the judicial reform. I'm happy to get into it, but we also don't need to go in that tangent. And there, that was, again, I really ultimately, as an educator, wanted students to understand it enough to be able to confidently argue both sides and understand both sides. But when positions are illegitimate, when I view them just completely off the rockers, you know, sure, I can probably, I've consumed enough garbage takes to be able to give you the anti-Zionist Israel has no legitimacy case. But like, students don't need to know that any more than we need to teach, you know, creationism on the same level as evolution. It's like it's interesting to know that there are people who still believe the universe is 5,000 years old and that evolution is some, myth or whatever. But like educationally, I'm not interested in people knowing, well, here are all the nuts and bolts, and here's how you respond to a creationist. At some point, it's like, if you don't believe in evolution, like, okay,
Right.
great.
I guess my question and something that I'm processing with you and off this podcast is when do you entertain this both sidism kind of narrative? And I hate to always have to go back to the Holocaust, but in let's say if I were to design a new course on the Holocaust and I wanted to teach about the German perspective, right? The Wilhelm Marr perspective that preceded the rise of Nazism and the birth of anti-Semitism as a word, anti-Semitism in the late 19th century. To what degree do I entertain German narrative of, you know, fears and anxieties that the Jews were becoming a political threat? Or what if, even if we don't want to go to the Holocaust, we can go to the Khmelnytsky massacre in the 1600s. You know, should we entertain the idea that the Khmelnytsky was worried that the Jews were forming political alliances with the Polish nobility? And in that way, teach the narrative. That's my issue. When do you say certain narratives I'm not going to entertain, right? But as an educator, I'm also an educator like you. I do think that my job is to present as much information to my students. But as I see, I have
Yeah.
this moment where I'm like, where do I kind of, where's my eruv, so to speak? Where are
Hmm.
my borders? What are your
I
thoughts?
think if it's done right, you can kind of have both. I mean, I think educational, assuming you're, academic education, not, Jewish religious education, I differentiate between the two, should be pretty descriptive. I think, let's pick the Khmelnytsky massacres or the Holocaust. A deep understanding of that should both come out with people understanding how politically and sociologically and economically fraught these situations were. And then, if somebody properly understands how anti Semitism always manifests in a conspiracy to scapegoat the Jews for whatever society needs at that moment or hates the most at that moment, it sort of connect the dots, right? Like anti Semitism is an idea, but it's not a vehicle, if that makes sense, right? Anti Semitism can imagine like anti-Semitism is water. You can't drink water if you don't have a vessel, but there are many types of vessels, right? There's bottles, there's cups. You can put it in a bowl, you can put it in, whatever. And so you kind of have to understand both. If you want to understand the mechanism of like this cup of water, you got to know the cup. And in this case, the cup is post World War I, economic collapse in Germany. All of these reasons, people being really upset and thinking that there was, people who weren't sufficiently German enough in World War I to help them win. That's important. And then the water is like, okay, well, you have, you know, medieval Christian anti-Semitism, Martin Luther's anti-Semitism, Protocols of Elders of Zion, new race sciences and, quote unquote, anti-Semitism. And like that was the water being poured in. And like it just so happens that every time there's socio-political / economic collapse, because there's already this water there, the second somebody gets a vessel, the thing that's going to be poured in it is the anti-Semitism. So I think, we probably make a
That's
mistake.
why
Yeah.
I just want to interrupt you, and that's why I am concerned about these conversations with settler violence. And I don't personally use the word settler to describe the Jews living in Judea, Samaria, but let's go with that for now. And I'm not saying we're not going to talk about it. We could talk about it, but the problem is that that's the vessel, but the likelihood of it bringing in the water, the anti-Semitism, and showing me a Jew with fangs who lives in Judea Samaria, settler, drinking blood, who's a violent warmonger, who's basically the reason why there's no peace in the middle in the Israel Arab Israeli conflict. It's it it opens the door so easily for the water, quote unquote, to come in through that vehicle. That's my concern.
Yeah, yeah. So I think then I would mostly agree with you. I mean, I still think, right, like we can't, I think one of the big secrets of Jewish success is that we've been able to be very thoughtful and intellectually nuanced for thousands of years. I mean, we open any page of the Talmud and, that's what it is. And when, I always compare with students, you know, when the Christian world was holding, the Council of Nicaea in the fourth century and coming together, confirming the one true doctrine for all of humanity. And when the Islamic world in the seventh century was coming up with, the one true doctrine for all of humanity, the rabbis in the Talmud were sitting there saying, well, there's 70 faces of the Torah, and these are the words of God, and I can believe something's kosher, and you can believe it's not. Again, within bounds. I don't want to be too anachronistic there. And so we've always, I think Jewish pride is always the ability to kind of speak to both directions. I mean, I think, what you're describing with settler violence or whatever we want to call it is another very interesting case where, in my mind, I think there's two different conversations to have about it. And I'm curious, again, push back if you disagree. One, when I'm talking with friends or family or community members of mine, and I have many friends and family who lives, in Judea and Samaria slash West Bank slash whatever word we want to use, and are, not supporting it, but they don't even think it's a problem at all. That conversation, I'm going to sort of be pushing back and say, like, guys, what the heck? Like, even if it's one time in the history of Israel, it's too much for, a Jew to go in and just start burning down random, houses in a Palestinian village. That said, we have to keep some proportionality. This isn't some, massive phenomenon that's happening every single day that represents, any major faction of Israeli society or anything like that. And so if I'm on campus and somebody who's very anti-Israel comes up and says, well, Palestinians have Hamas and the Jews have the settlers. And I say, well, Pew polling in, the Palestinian world is that Hamas, one was democratically elected, years ago, but, holds a very high approval rating. Whereas the settlers, even among people who live in Judea and Samaria, the percentage of people who think this is reasonable is maybe single digits. So, like, this is not a proportional conversation. So, like, it very much differentiates regarding who I'm talking about. Not that I think I'm lying, but I think it's just two completely different things compared to where people's premises are. So, if we're talking in your premise, as are, many of my Jewish students, they love Israel. Israel has a right to exist. Israel's generally on the right moral side in this war against Islamism, all things I believe. Then, within that context, I feel very comfortable saying, and here are three things that Israel's doing really wrong that I disagree with, because we're already operating within a certain, framework of, okay, well, you're not some like crazy anti-Semite who's going to take my words and twist it. If you are some crazy anti-Israelist on campus, I'm not going to give that any credence because that's that's whataboutism, and you're focusing on some tiny minority. The same way, I mean, I kind of like the kid analogy. I have a 6 month old baby at home, so it's hitting home a lot more. When my kid, I can imagine when they're in second grade, I'm gonna want to get, push my kid to be the best, right? I want my kid to be the best kid in class. And so another way of saying that is I personally am going to hold my kid to a double standard. And if they do anything that I view as wrong, again, I'm saying this as, hopefully I'll keep up this mindset. I want to say like, hey, here's what you can do better. I'm not going to say that to the other random kid because I just expect less of them. But if the teacher starts holding my kid to a double standard and starts giving them worse grades, even though they're doing better work, I'm going to get in there and be like, hey, what the hell? And it wouldn't be a reasonable argument for someone to say, but wait a minute, the other day you were just telling me you hold your kid to a higher standard. Like, it's completely different things.
Agreed. No, I think that what you're saying is essential, which is where are you having these conversations? Are you having them with a hostile crowd? Are you having them internally within the Jewish world? That really matters. That dictates how the message is going to be received and how it's going to be weaponized or, basically manipulated. So totally agree with you there. I mean, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but there is an important organization called Reguvim, I think it's called, Regavim in Hebrew, and they monitor basically settlements. And I keep on doing the air quotes around settlements because I just personally don't like to use those words. We're not probably going to get it into that today, but and basically they shut down and disprove rather a lot of the misinformation and disinformation that is coming out about illegal settlements sprouting. They're actually monitoring Arab, actually illegal settlements in Area C, by the way, of Judea Samaria. But that, of course, doesn't get attention. So even the conversation around settlements, quote unquote, and that they're the major obstacle to peace or these violent settlers, that itself, I think, needs to be scrutinized. Now, am I saying that there are no hoodlums, no violence? The Jews can never be violent? Absolutely not, right? And I agree with you that we need to dispense with this idyllic, image that we have in the diaspora around Israel. But here, I'm going to kind of go back to my Russian literature. Dostoevsky, in one of his journals, diary entries, wrote that we do not judge a society based on the amount of miscreants or criminals, but how the society dispenses with those criminals. And I think that's important to remember. It's not every civilization is going to have its criminals, the people who violate civilizational order. That's. But the big question is, what is the institute, this civilizational institution, the state here? How are they going to respond? So and if you are going to have that comparison between the Palestinian Arabs and the Israelis, when the Palestinian Arab names a street after a martyr or a school after a martyr, there is no school in Israel named Baruch Goldstein. There's no street in Israel named Baruch Goldstein because we do not lionize, we do not idealize the criminal. And that's
Maybe this is a little bit of a hot take, but I firmly believe it. In the same way, my kid analogy, and I do this personally and want the Jewish community to do this and no one else. I just expect more from Israeli society than I do from Palestinian society. Like for me, and I hold Israel to a double standard. I don't want anyone else to do it, but for me, and I think this gets back to the religious conversation before, growing up, firmly believing, and I still do, that Israel is an integral religious value for me as a Jew and somebody who is a practicing Jew and religious Jew and teaches Judaism. Israel is a religious vehicle in my mind versus, I don't know, Egypt or Syria that are just, war-torn countries, mixed with some of the worst ideas in human civilization, Islamism. And so in that way, again,
they're
it's
flawed. God didn't create us perfect. It's impossible. Yes, Israel, the idea of Israel is holy. And because something is holy, you're going to definitely want an uplifted image of that. But human beings are flawed.
no, for
Jews are
sure. But
human.
but the religious ideal, I think, in Judaism is to understand we're never going to get to perfection while constantly pushing towards it. And so, I think part of Judaism, and I think, I apply the same thinking to Israel, you're never there, right? Like you never get perfect because perfection is only limited to God, and we don't believe humans can become God in Judaism. But it means that there's always ways that something could improve, and it's actually worthwhile focusing on that. Again, this is a very internal conversation. I
Yeah.
don't want the UN to be thinking of ways Israel can improve because, quite frankly, Israel, I still believe, is the
Do
most
not.
moral country in the world. Like, I mean, and I've defended that on campus. I think the IDF is the most moral army in the world. I'll defend that. And yet, if the IDF is less than perfect, which by definition it is, because it's not God, I will criticize things the IDF has done because, in my mind, I don't want to compare the IDF to Hamas or even the American army. I compare the IDF to my highest lofty religious ideals. Again, that's why it's a little bit of a hot
Let me
take. Yeah,
let me push back. Let me ask you
please.
a question. If I'm a non-Jew and I see Jews doing it, for me, it gives me permission to do it too. Do you not believe that when Jews do this, how can we then be angry with the UN for doing this if the Jews themselves are holding themselves to different standards and are doing it of good intention because they want to uplift the world, they want to uplift themselves, they want to bring Hashem closer into this world and his laws. If I'm not Jewish, forget even Jewish, take any minority. If I'm not minority X and I see minority X begin to speak in ways that is very self-critical, I think it would give me much more of a sense of permission to do that as well.
Mm. I think you're right. I think it is an important challenge. Two things that come to mind. I love this conversation. One, whether we like it or not, because this is some of people's least favorite Jewish texts. For 2,000 years, we have been extremely self-critical. I mean, the rabbis blame the destruction of the temples not on a strong Babylonian and Roman army, but on ourselves. We blame, in the writings after the Crusades, the Ashkenazi community in Germany and France, we're not blaming the Crusaders. They were saying, what have we done so I think this is a deep part of Judaism, perhaps one of the secrets to our survival, that we hate victimizing ourselves so much that even things that are obviously not our faults, we try to figure out, why we deserved it. I'm not saying that's good. I'm saying that that does exist in Jewish literature. The second thing is, I think, with the UN or the New York Times, it's a qualitative difference. So if the New York Times says Israel's committing genocide, I'm not going to say, oh, well, this is a valid opinion and maybe we should, be self-critical in how we're doing this, because that's just a qualitatively different, if somebody tells me that my kid is the most immoral person to ever exist, I'm not going to say, yeah, you're right. She could be a little bit better at sharing, snacks with her friends. Like, so maybe you're 0.1% right. I'm going to say, no, you're just wrong. You're being, in this case, anti-Semitic, or you're just, have a bias against my kid. That said, like I don't think that we should give up the thing that's, I think, made Judaism and Jewish ideas and the religious value of the state of Israel itself, which is this sort of ability to want to hold ourselves to a high standard. So they are in tension a little bit, but I think I don't think it's a slippery slope to, like, next thing you know, we're accusing Israel of genocide.
Yeah. Listen, it is tension and a slippery slope. And that's all I want to call our attention to, because going back, if I was the teacher accusing your child of committing terrible things and holding your child to a different standard, and you came to me and go, what are you doing? I'd say, well, your wife just said the same thing. I feel emboldened to do that because your wife, let's say, or your partner, shared with me that she is upset about that X, Y, and Z. I'm just saying we have to be careful how we speak, not just internally, but externally. And I think,
Totally. But I still have a vested interest in my daughter being the best girl in her future second grade class, and that is my goal. Just like I have a vested interest in Israel being the most moral country in the world and a reflection of all of my values. And so I think I'm willing to err on that side, even if that will invite maybe, some biased attacks, because I view that idea as really important and special. And I think even getting back to, Echad Am, which is a lot of what he was talking about, whereas, it can't just be a state of Jews, it has to be a Jewish state in some way. And
yes,
the reality is, yeah. And so, but it is certainly a tension.
yeah. Well, we're wrapping up, but this was definitely very, very interesting. I'm really glad, just to let you know, it makes me so happy to know that you exist for the Jewish students at UC Irvine. I think that they're very, very, very lucky to have you. Um, I do want to end by asking you just a few more kind of questions. Well, you're coming back right now in the fall, to UC Irvine. It's been 2 years since October 7th. What is your sense in terms of campus anti-Semitism? Do you feel that we're having another year of encampments? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think people in the liberal Jewish world hate it when I say this, but Trump really did do a lot to mitigate campus anti-Semitism. It doesn't mean everything's perfect, and people probably still hold the views, but the number of anti-Israel rallies and encampments and disruptions and things that we were seeing after Trump got into office, it's like night and day.
And you do think
And
it's because of Trump, the
I
administration?
do think it's because of federal government's pressure on both universities, and it kind of shook. Again, people respond to money and status, right? So what was happening with the encampments were a lot of these very loud, outspoken anti-Israel professor students or grad students who had a lot of Twitter followers. The last thing any campus administration wanted was for somebody to share on Twitter, X administrator just disbarred our encampment and they are anti-Muslim and Islamophobic and anti-Palestinian. And now Trump's upped the ante and said, no, no, no. Actually, the worst thing that can happen to your campus is to be, on trial for $500 million or whatever. And, whether or not it's right or wrong, that's sort of a separate conversation of like what's happening at UCLA and the other universities. But in terms of cause and effect, certainly it has made, I feel safer as a Jew on campus after Trump got into office, for sure. People hate it when I say that, but it
Wow,
just
you
like
went on
is.
record and said that.
No, no,
That's
no. I say that on my podcast all the time, and I also usually addend that with, and I didn't vote for Trump, and yet, like, we have to be honest. And, people all the time, it's funny because everyone who listens to that, they're either upset I didn't vote for Trump then, or they're upset that I'm willing to say that, like, yes, Jews are safer in America because of Trump. So that's neither here nor there. Last year on October 7th, there was a huge anti-Israel rally on October 7th. Again, it's always funny because the anti-Israel commemoration of October 7th doesn't start when the war started, which, you know, might have a tinge of
so
reasonableness to
telling, by
it.
the way, so telling.
Yeah, it starts on October 7th, so it's not a commemoration of Palestinian lives lost in the last 2 years. It is a pro October
Celebration.
7th rally. Yeah, so I think we have to call it like it is. I started calling it pro Hamas rallies. Like, I don't think we can, this language of pro
Absolutely.
Israel or pro Palestinian, I think is crazy. I think, I know plenty of Zionists who are pro-Palestinian. I view myself as pro-Palestinian, right? I think life would be better for the Palestinians if Hamas and Islamic Jihad and, general Islamism went away, right? So I think calling them pro-Palestinian and not as anti-Israelist or anti-Zionist or just pro-terrorism, like, I think that's a, languaging or naming mistake. Campus is definitely quieted down. It's obviously still going to be lurking in the background. We're planning right now for a commemoration of October 7th. There's a big tension because it's on Sukkot this year. And so do you do it after
That's the
Sukkot? Do you
best,
do it
but
on
that's the
Sukkot?
best tension. I thought you were going to say there's a big tension. The administration doesn't want us to do this. And I was like,
No, no, no. The administration at UC Irvine, I'll give them a lot of props. They've been very supportive, even before, the Trump administration. They've been really great, and almost all of them have understood how problematic what's going on is. Again, I think they felt pressured because the last thing anybody wants. I mean, the chancellor of UC Irvine, um, his house got protested in front of
yeah.
many nights. They found the phone numbers of his wife and children and were texting them threatening messages. Like, that really sucks. Like, I mean, I don't know what I would do if somebody found my daughter's, I mean, she's 6 months, but eventual cell phone number and started threatening her. That would probably change how I act in public and, who I'm willing to condemn and who I'm not. Even if I want to say, yeah, 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 I'd always stand up for what's right. Like, I can't say that I would obviously do that. So, despite those constraints, that's why I do think the Trump administration has helped, because before, you couldn't really gain anything by sticking up for Jews on campus because, the quad in academia was surrounded by these staunch anti-Israelist voices. And so the administration, even if they understood this is problematic for people marching outside of Jewish studies classes with, globalize the Intifada, what did they really have to gain by breaking it up? All they were going to do was have, 50 students point their phones at this person and try to dox them, and which happened. And so a lot of them just kind of quietly hoped the problem would go away, which obviously it didn't. And now the Trump administration essentially says, if you don't do this, we're going to take away millions of dollars from you. And now campuses are like, oh shoot, we gotta go ahead and do this. So that's why I do think it made a difference. But listen, I think Jewish students, I mean, again, there's been such a overwhelming desire to become a part of Jewish community on campus across really all campuses. What I'm hearing from Hillels and Chabads is that, the rooms are overflowing. People are interested in learning more about Jewish community, Jewish identity, Israel, Jewish history. Every single one of my Jewish studies classes has been completely full
That's
across
awesome.
campus. And so, people are really interested in connecting.
That's wonderful. That's really great news. So thank you so much. Also, just want to plug in your show because you have some amazing guests you've had, including myself. But no, um, so it's on YouTube,
Yeah,
and
if you just go on YouTube and type in Rabbi Daniel Levine, you should be
yeah,
able to get it. And definitely check out the episode with Naya because it was a really good one. I told you, I think, offline, but I've been getting a lot of very positive feedback from that. And it's an area that needs to be talked about a lot more in terms of, Soviet anti-Semitism and how it migrated to America.
right. Well, thanks so much for joining me on this very special episode of Don't Know Much About. Like, share widely.
Don't
Until
know
next
much
time.
about history.